Good morning, everybody, and you're most welcome to this seminar this morning, which I think is going to be a fascinating hour or so that we've got together. My name's Tim Bissett, and I'm the director of the St Martin in the Fields charity. You may know us through our annual BBC Radio 4 Christmas appeal with St Martin in the Fields, or you may know us through our Vickers Relief Fund, which provides crisis grants to get people into accommodation, or you may be a member of the St Martin's Frontline Network, which provides support to thousands of frontline workers across the UK, or indeed you may not, but there you go. Anyway, you're most welcome to this Impact Forum session organised by the Centre for Homelessness Impact. It's an independent organisation that supports the use of data and evidence in bringing about a sustainable end to homelessness. The theme of the 2021 Impact Forum has been collective resilience. And today is the last of 5 days of live online events exploring what resilience means to individuals and organisations working in homelessness and in related fields. So what we're going to try and do on this last day of the forum is galvanise us all in working towards a future where homelessness is only ever rare, brief and non-recurrent. I'm really pleased this morning that we've got two speakers with us. We were hoping that Chris O'Connell from NICE would be with us, but unfortunately he can't be here today. But we still have two, I think, terrific speakers who are going to be both informative and stimulating for us. Our first speaker will be Times columnist and Conservative peer, Danny Finkelstein. And we're also joined by Vanessa Howarth, who's head of the Greater Manchester Mayor's charity. So you're both most welcome. We're going to leave a bit of time at the end to make sure that we can answer any questions and take comments. People, I suspect, will know how to do that in the chat, and we will attempt to answer those questions if we have time at the end, and we'll be as full as we can with those. So now we're going to hear from our first speaker, Danny, who's going to be considering really how organisations, which are often tempted to do the same things, but how they can perhaps begin to do things in a slightly different way. Our question really is, how can we create a learning culture amongst people working in homelessness so that they are prepared to test long-held assumptions and perhaps try things a bit differently? And how can we encourage a spirit of inquiry so that people can act promptly, and if new evidence emerges, that they can use that new evidence and policy intervention perhaps to try something a little different. So, Danny, I'm going to hand over to you. You've got about 15 minutes or so. Yeah, thank you. Danny.
Tim, thank you. Gosh, that sounds amazing, that talk. I can't wait to hear myself. Hang on. Can't wait to hear myself talk. It's you that's muted, not me. I thought for a minute I was muted. You'll see behind me a lot of books, and that's not just because I'm messy, but also because I'm writing a book myself, and it's part of it will be about my grandfather, Dolu, who lived in Leboeuf and was on the city council, and his major contribution to city council was building houses and completing houses for the homeless. So it's an appropriate thing for me to be talking to you today, and I'm really grateful for the invitation. What I want to do is talk about, I suppose, common mistakes in thinking about political issues, because my view is that the recognition of those errors is the best way to try to put them right. I should warn you that doesn't completely work. Recognizing these, unfortunately, doesn't totally solve them. You probably need other people to inquire into your thinking, to press you on your thinking in order to do that. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner for economics, he was really a social psychologist, and he himself developed a lot of ideas about how we had cognitive biases, made errors about that led us away from evidence-based decision making. And when he was writing his book on the subject, somebody asked him how long it was going to take him. And he said, I think it'll take me about 9 months. And his friend laughed and said, you've written yourself about how nothing diverges that much from the average. And here you are assuming that your own book will do that. And Daniel Kahneman realized that despite the fact that he was writing in the book about cognitive behavioral errors, he was still making them. So the bad news at the beginning of my talk is that even the things that I'm about to say will not cure you entirely of making these cognitive errors. But the good news is that if you can recognize them, you can get other people to interrogate your thinking, and maybe you'll be open to listen to their interrogation. The first error, actually very obvious in the field in which I'm involved in, political punditry, is that lots of people overcorrelate for their expert knowledge. Nobody wants to be the idiot that learned something only to discover it was irrelevant. So we assume that the things that we learn must be important. If you listen to football commentators, they will often say things like, the worst time to concede a goal is just before half time, which is something they learned from another football commentator, and is something that people who know nothing about football will be wondering why on earth that would be a bad time to concede a goal. And those people who know nothing about football will be right. There's no statistical reason why it would be a bad thing. It's just a piece of law that you learnt and that people embed into their thinking. So there are lots of examples where we assume that other people have got the same expert knowledge that we have. In politics, for example, there was an incident where Andrew Mitchell left 10 Downing Street. He was the chief whip of the Conservative Party, and he either did or didn't call the policeman on the door a pleb, and it caused a massive political row, was on the front page of newspapers for weeks. He eventually had to resign, and lots of people thought that David Cameron would pay a big political price for this because he was trying to take the Conservative Party away from being snobby, and here was his chief whip doing the exact opposite of what David was trying to lead the party away from. I always thought would have no impact at all. That is because nobody knows who Andrew Mitchell is, right? People didn't read the story. They don't remember the story. They don't believe what they read in the newspapers. They don't believe politicians. They don't believe police officers. And lots of people don't know what a pleb is. They might know that it was a bad term, but they wouldn't necessarily know that it meant a term that sort of was class, was a sort of piece of class disrespect. And so it didn't have any impact politically. That's also because by the time the general election came around, people had also forgotten it, even if they ever minded about it. And we make this mistake all the time. We assume that the terminology that we use is the terminology other people can understand, and that people's expert knowledge is way in excess of it. I remember going to a restaurant with a friend of mine, and there was a football match on television, and my friend happened to say to the person, "Oh, that Daniel writes football columns for the Times," which I did at that time. And the woman was really interested. I worked for the Times, and eventually it came out that I really wrote about politics. She said, "Oh, I'm really interested about politics." And we got into a conversation about how the political stories appeared in the newspaper. And at no point did she recognize that my friend was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And that is because people don't necessarily know who the political leaders are. When I was working for John Major, the Liberal Democrats ran on a policy of putting a penny on tax to pay for education. And we were told this was very popular. Well, first of all, it was obvious to me people wouldn't know what the Lib Dem policy on anything was. But if they did know it, was it popular? And I thought it wouldn't be because people don't like paying more tax, but I was wrong. Actually, it turned out they were in favour of putting a penny on tax to pay for education, but not a penny in the pound. They didn't realise that's what it meant, just a penny. And so the whole of the political world was using a term that didn't mean anything to anybody else. And these were very common terms, and lots of the terms that you will be thinking to use in your policy debates or seeking to influence politicians about will be terms that you understand that other people don't. You know, I'm on a board of a company, and at first I had to rather embarrassingly ask what BAU meant, business as usual. And they all thought that was a completely normal term. And even though I'm quite well invested in these things, I'd never heard it. So the first thing I would say is that your own expert knowledge is something that you probably overcorrelate for when you talk to other people, or when you assume it makes a difference. The second rule I apply to these things is what I call the Mandy Rice Davis rule. This came from the court case, the Profumo court case, in which Mandy Rice Davis was a witness, and the barrister said to her that Lord Astor denied her claim to have slept with him. And what does she make of that? And she replied, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Well, this is a very good phrase to apply to almost everybody you hear saying something political. And that really importantly includes you and me. People, I was sitting in the taxi cab, we were driving around Parliament Square, and there were a lot of white vans, and they were part in their way of the taxi, and the taxi driver knew I had something to do with politics, so he said, what are they protesting about? And I said, oh, I don't really know. And then I thought for a second, I thought, you know what, I know what they're protesting about. They want you and me to give them some of our money, and they think it's in the public interest. The reason that I knew that they thought that is because everybody thinks that about everything, whatever their cause is, whether it's themselves or the thing that they're attached to. And they don't necessarily, because it's in their own interests, they have begun to work in their heads, because our brain is the lawyer of our emotion. They've begun to work in their heads the reason why this is actually in everybody else's interest and not just their own. It's an extremely difficult thing to get your head out. I remember meeting at a party somebody, and she started to talk to me about nurses' wages. And as I got to talk to her, her husband said, I'd be careful because she's a nurse. Well, it turned out that was indeed the case. That doesn't mean she was wrong, by the way. I think she was probably right. But that doesn't, she wasn't able, I think, to distinguish, and none of us are able to do that, between our own interests necessarily and the public interest, and where our interest came from. Now, we're very good at deeply embedding our own self-interest in our arguments in such a way that we don't even notice it ourselves. There's an amazing set of work on evolutionary psychology which suggests the root of deception is that we have to be able to deceive ourselves first in order to be good at deceiving other people. There's no question that we are, very able at it. But let me give you an example of this. Political correctness gone mad, right? So if you think of political correctness, why would somebody be strongly in favor of it? Well, political correctness is about asserting civic equality. And in a highly educated society, very able and clever people discover that one of the few things that might stop them from gaining the benefits of their capability is that there's civic inequality. They're gay, they're women, they're from ethnic minorities. They are denied the right that you would expect. So those people, because they've got, they then argue very strongly for civic equality, and political correctness becomes very important to them. And so you would expect the most strongly in favor of civic equality, of political correctness, to be female academics from ethnic minority groups. And that's exactly what you discover. Now, who would think that political correctness has gone mad? Well, it turns out to be those people who've got low social capital and for whom civic inequality is the one way of protecting what otherwise would be their low income. In other words, you would expect it to be older white males living in crumbling seaside constituencies, UKIP. None of those people would think that economic reasons underpinned what appeared to be their social attitudes, and yet there's an obvious correspondence between those things. And I always say that as somebody who's a prosperous metropolitan Jew with a master's degree. I am a social liberal and relatively an economic liberal, and I'm also therefore a complete cliche. Of course, I think all of those things are to do with my experience and to do with my cogitation, but it just so happens they correspond quite strongly with my interests, and I don't think that's a coincidence. That would be my second point. The third cognitive sort of type of error, I mean, there are lots of these, but I'm just going to concentrate on four. The third one is we're very loss averse, and we think about things that we have differently to things that we are going to get. So let me give you the example of ticket booths at railway stations. If I said to you, I've got a plan, I'm going to take the train staff off the concourse, I'm going to put them in a little office, and if you want to talk to them, you have to queue up in a queue up. And this is going to be very expensive for the railway system, but in order to reduce your ability to talk to the train staff, we're going to have to cancel night trains in order to pay for this new policy. You would think I was completely mad. Why on earth would anyone do that? And yet, when London Underground proposed to close their tube their ticket offices, put the staff on the concourse so they were easier to access, and then use the money they saved for the night trains that they would then introduce, everyone was against it because they didn't want to close the ticket offices. These were two of the same policies framed either as a loss or a gain, and when framed as a loss, people are strongly opposed to it. It's partly about how you present the policies that you're advancing, understanding that people are loss averse, and partly about understanding yourself and your own reactions. I think a lot of culture war arguments about statues and about universities are actually arguments about loss aversion. That monuments that people don't even know exist, they suddenly don't want to get rid of, and positions they couldn't defend, which is, we should put up a monument to a slave trader. They wouldn't put one up, but they don't want to take it down. This is loss aversion at its finest. And let me deal then with the last one. But I think in many ways, it's the most important when dealing with evidence-based thinking. It's consistency and commitment. We are desperate basically to remain consistent to the positions that we've taken up. There was a mystery, I don't know whether you recall this incident, over baby P, the baby that was unfortunately murdered by parents when social services had visited 60 times. And the question was, how could they have visited so many times and got it wrong? Well, one of my colleagues at the Times said to me, I think the reason is simple. It's not despite visiting 60 times, it's because they visited 60 times. And what happened was that they developed a theory, and each time they visited, that they reinforced that theory, because that's what we do. We reinforce the theory that we have, and we present the evidence to ourselves as, increasing our commitment to the theory about the position that we already have. And by the way, you'll see this all the time with court cases, right? Even the introduction of DNA has not persuaded people to avoid committing themselves to the guilt of somebody they prosecuted. And it's a very interesting feature here. You would think, wouldn't you, that if you had painfully involved yourself in the prosecution of somebody and then later discovered that the person that was executed or sent to jail for a long time had been falsely prosecuted, you would be among the first to be strongly against what had happened and to commit yourself to reversing this. It's very rare that that happens. The more painful and the more embarrassing the consequences of our error, the more that we invested in making it, the more likely we are to continue being committed to it. It was a very fascinating thing with the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition. Lots of people thought to themselves, the Liberal Democrats will pull out of this coalition because it's been an absolute disaster for them. You can see that. But the thing was, because it was an absolute disaster, they became more and more committed. They don't want to be the idiots that incurred this absolute massive loss for no reason whatsoever. So they dug themselves in more, the worse it got. And therefore, they were always likely, I thought it was at the beginning, but they were always likely to still be with the coalition when it finished in 2015, precisely because of what they'd been through in order to make it happen. As I say, these are only, I suppose, a small selection of the cognitive biases that you engage in that take you away from evidence-based thinking. There are many brilliant books on this. I particularly like Robert Cialdini's book Persuasion. He's got a new edition of it out with more different cognitive problems. I really recommend that. But if you can try hard to get other people to use some of these principles to examine what you're doing and realize that you yourself will find it hard to see them, will think, yes, these do generally exist, but they don't apply to my particular position on X or Y, then you will be stronger, because you have to recognize these are very tenacious. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I've been scribbling notes, and we've got some questions coming in, but I think we'll just save those for a moment. And let me ask Vanessa next if you'll make your contribution. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for inviting us to participate today. We've been working quite closely with the Centre for Homelessness Impact now for about 6 months, and it's really nice to be part of your event. So first, big thanks to Lydia and the team. I guess my presentation today is a bit more of a kind of pragmatic, operational kind of picture really of what it's like to be a relatively new funder, an organisation working in the homelessness sector who's trying to build a kind of evidence-based approach. So I'm conscious not many people may have heard of us and know much about the organisation. So I'm going to just give you a kind of potted history of Greater Manchester Mayor's Charity, some of the context around the work that we're doing in Greater Manchester, and then just talk through in a way the journey we've been on and the challenges that's thrown up for us as well. So it's a bit more of a pragmatic kind of presentation, but I think it will create some nice dialogue and questions actually in a bit of a contrast. So Greater Manchester Mayor's Charity, independent charity. Obviously our patron is Andy Burnham, who's been a huge advocate for work in the homelessness field, and in fact when he was first elected, numbers of people who'd found themselves rough sleeping in Manchester City region were sky high, higher than they've been in a decade. So there was a huge emphasis at that time on tackling what was a humanitarian crisis, and so a mayoral fund was created on a Just Giving platform, and £250,000 was raised quite quickly, and essentially that kind of money led everyone to see that this needed to be an independent charity, this needed to be a structure of its own, this had a future. You know, the people of Greater Manchester were committed to this cause. So over the next 12 months, 12 independent trustees were found, and a charity was formed. And I think this is one of the really interesting things about Greater Manchester Mayor's Charity is the cross-sector nature of this trustee board. So we've got property developers and business owners and people from the financial sector and the health sector and experts in the homelessness field and in the faith sectors within Greater Manchester. We've had a trustee with lived experience on the board. So it's been a real melting pot of ideas, perspectives, angles. And I think that's really challenged people's language. And that in itself makes us question assumptions all the time, double check things, because you're not in the bubble of speaking the same language with each other. And I think that's making a really big difference actually to the drive for data with us. I joined in about May last year, so just 12 months ago, and the trustees had been doing an incredible job, but really running the charity without a team. And raising huge amounts of cash. So about £2.7 million has come in and pretty much all gone out now, largely around homelessness and largely around this humanitarian response, this crisis that was happening in Manchester. So people will have heard of A Bed Every Night, and the Mayor's charity was a really key funder in that space. And then COVID hit just as I'd arrived and suddenly things shifted again. And so then there was a real need in the sector for fast, quick money to be able to enable people to adapt their service delivery, to put in place social distancing measures, to buy PPE. So then the charity sort of shifted to that mode, and there were 3 or 4 rounds of emergency funding going out really quickly last year. We've had some brilliant feedback from the frontline sector around the speed with which that was delivered and the fact that it was unrestricted funding. The fact that that just really enabled people to gear up what they needed to do in the midst of COVID. And then we've had, thankfully, after all this kind of shifting, a moment to sort of pause. And I think this is what really I've been working with the trustees on now and with CHI since late last year. Like, this charity formed with all this momentum and all this engagement, and then dealt with 2 really quite massive issues. But who are we? What are we here for? What's the long-term goal of this charity, and what's the relationship with the patron, and how do we make decisions, and where's our place in the ecosystem? And so you naturally start to go and look then, don't you, for the data, for the dashboard that some of our private sector trustees would have loved to see. And this is when I reached out to Lydia and the CHI team to say, we're in the midst of the Greater Manchester ecosystem, but we actually want to look outwards too. And we want to use data. We want to learn from other places. We want to help this position us. So we've done quite a lot of work with the CHI team. We had some really fascinating, intense sessions looking at the numbers here in Greater Manchester, looking at what's happening in other places in the world. And the picture in Greater Manchester is really interesting because there's been an incredible shift and an awful lot of progress in reducing the numbers of people rough sleeping. But if you think of that as the tip of the iceberg, all those lower levels of hidden homelessness, statutory homelessness, the data shows that there's pressure building there. And so it's really enabled us to start to think about where we want to be acting. Do we just want to do this emergency response, or do we want to take a step back and do more preventative work? Do we want to look at accommodation? So these kinds of conversations have been driven by data, thankfully provided by CHI in many ways, and the brilliant team they've got there. I think the pause has also been really useful for the trustees and now a small team, now there are 3 of us, to also really start to think about what it is that we want to do, what's our role, because 2.7 million in a couple of years is a great set of numbers, but it's not kind of world changing, is it? We can't fund everything, we can't fund everyone. And what's our position? And we've come to this point of thought leadership as a kind of niche for us. So what we feel we can do with having private sector links and the ability to bring in quite sizable donations and independence and autonomy, we can take risks. So we can identify where there's promising practice, perhaps in another field or perhaps in another place, and we can test that in Greater Manchester. We can fund that pilot. And the outcome, the valuable outcome, if you like, is proven practice then, isn't it? It's we can burden the risk that maybe public sector or statutory bodies couldn't, and hopefully provide the evidence then for a rollout of more effective solutions. So we aren't necessarily thinking about funding organisations anymore, but pioneering ideas and testing ideas and seeing what works and what doesn't. And I guess one of the challenges of that is we may well fail. Some of these things might not work, and that's also quite a strange thing for the charity world, I think, to accept and embrace, because it's public money, isn't it, a lot of the time, and there's a sense of responsibility. But I think you learn from failure as much as you learn from success, and There are gaps in the data. There is a need to test these things, and there's value in learning what works as well as what doesn't work. So we're prepared to fail as well. So our new strategy is going to be launched soon, and we've got a new website and a bit of a brand refresh going on now after this pause and after this kind of sort of time, really, I guess, to just take stock and think. And we've identified 3 strands that our funding will sit under. So the first is still emergency response. We won't walk away from what still remains a humanitarian crisis, and we will still continue to support a bed every night. And our support particularly sits around the NRPF cohort within that programme. And I know actually the next session this morning is about that, and Ian Rutherford, one of our trustees, is taking part in that panel. And there's an awful lot of work to be done in that space, and an awful lot of a case that needs building basically to government around that. So it's an innovative model, and what we've done is honed our position within that, if you like, and we're talking to CHI about how we can generate data through that section of funding. Then our second strand is places and spaces. So when we looked at the data in Greater Manchester, there were higher than average spends on temporary accommodation. The move on kind of function wasn't necessarily working as well as in other places, and we're interested in modular schemes, and there's a few fledgling modular schemes afoot in Greater Manchester, and the Mayor's Charity is going to be backing hopefully several of these over the coming years, and looking at the difference that a wraparound package of support makes within a modular scheme, or location, or other variables. We kind of want to help support the build, but actually invest in some studies around these schemes as they emerge, so that we can again start to generate learning and data for the rollout of buildings and beds, which is essentially what we all know. Homes are the answer to this, aren't they? Within this, we're starting to think outside the realms of being a normal traditional funder. There are more innovative kind of finance models, social impact bonds, community shares. We're starting to actually, by following the data, break down the barriers of what a traditional grant giving charity might be perceived to be, which I think is really interesting. And it'll be within our places and spaces work that we start to explore that. And then our final strand, our third strand, is targeted prevention. So we're particularly interested here in direct cash transfers, which is something we've been talking to Legia and the team really about, and we're hoping to pilot these with a couple of cohorts over the next 12 months in relatively small numbers. But the idea here is that we test something that is scalable. There's a fully funded RCT around it, so that the evidence is really sound, so that others might then be able to roll out schemes like this if they work, and we can then use that data to go back to our donors and corporates and have real evidence that their investment will make a real difference through that kind of intervention. So there's lots of things at play, and we've found ourselves in this position for the first time really of having had this chance to take stock, and now starting to piece together the data and the evidence that exists. We're challenging ourselves quite a lot about, especially at board and in team conversations, is that a fact or is that an assumption? Do we know that, or do we feel that? So those kinds of questions have become more part of our vocabulary as well since beginning to work with CHI, which I think is really healthy. We're also really clear now about what constitutes a project or a programme for us that we would be able to support. So it's got to be based on co-design. And we've actually just built a relationship with the Greater Manchester Homelessness Action Network, so that we have because we're not a frontline delivery organisation, we're a funder, we can be quite removed from the front line, but we're investing in GM Hand so that we've got a real robust mechanism there for consultation and co-design with lived experience and occupational experience. So it's got to be based on co-design, or it doesn't fit our criteria. It's got to be embedded in the ecosystem in Greater Manchester. There is a wealth of organisations doing incredible work up here, and we're the new kids on the block, and we're not here to you know, create duplicate structures or try and you know, kind of detract funding from other places. What we're trying to do here is give something to the sector, and that we think is data and ideas and practice, proven practice. And we're looking for things that are scalable and sustainable, because if they're not, then there's no point testing them. So again, looking at data as a fundamental part of our programmes helps us really define what we will and won't fund. There are some challenges around this. There are some real kind of it pushes you to really rethink what you are as an organisation and who you are as an organisation. So rather than a funder, I think we're beginning to see ourselves more of a community of change, of like a convener. We've got great relationships with potential donors and resources. We've got great relationships with the sector. We've got great relationships with CHI. And if we can start to bring all these things together, we can become something that's living and breathing and moving, and not just a grant maker. And that kind of sense of community and change and togetherness is becoming more and more part of our thinking. You know, this is a complex, huge, sometimes overwhelming space to work in, and an awful lot of people feel quite helpless, I think, about how they can make a difference to the lives of somebody experiencing homelessness, or, you know, the cause, the issue at large. But we're finding that dialogues and conversations and breaking it down and being really local are helping make that tangible. And that's by being a community. That's by being, you know, more than just forms and anonymous funders behind a website. That's by being out there and talking to people and challenge and, you know, and change. We also really want to challenge public framing of homelessness as well, and public perceptions. So there has been a lot of emphasis in Greater Manchester on providing spaces for people who've been rough sleeping, but we also know through the data that the number of families who are now experiencing homelessness or being made homeless due to some of this due to the economic fallout of COVID and other factors, but that's on the rise in Greater Manchester quite dramatically. So from that data, we've identified a need to challenge public perceptions of what homelessness is. And we're looking at that particularly through our comms now, and the language that we use and the images that we use and the way that we will talk publicly and with our donors about, you know, who homelessness affects, who it touches, because it's much closer to home than I think than most people realise. We're still in this really interesting position of being deeply embedded and within, but also looking outwards. And I think that's a really key role for us, to have the kind of the commitment and the roots in Greater Manchester, but eyes and ears out everywhere else, and seeing what's interesting in other places and bringing it to Greater Manchester, and also sharing outwardly what is so successful in Greater Manchester and the work that's happening there. So there's this like kind of push-pull situation that we're in, which I think is really rich for making change. And then I guess the other challenge really is that if you're truly committed to data and evidence, that costs. So you know, we want to build an evaluation and a proper robust study into every programme we fund going forward, and that means we're going to have to ask donors to accept that part of their donation might not go directly to just delivery, that some of this is around building the evidence and building the data, and that's quite a difficult concept, I think, for some. And this is where we're going to have to get really good at the conversations, because it's the bigger picture, isn't it? It's the greater good. It's the multiplication of impact if you can prove something. And so getting our donors on board with paying for study as well as delivery is really key, and will be a challenge. And then, like I said before, you know, there are different financial models that we can be looking at now, given the scale of what we feel we need to do and we want to do. So challenging the kind of notion of a charity being donations in and grants out, you know, looking at more interesting finance models, looking at more innovative ways of working, thinking of ourselves as investors, you know, less than funders. You know, it's about challenging some of those power structures that kind of exist in traditional grant making. It's about being stuck in, isn't it, and being kind of a key critical voice within the field. So yeah, that's our journey. That's where we are. The new team joined us about a month ago. The new website's about to come out in about 6 weeks. The strategy will be launched with that, with some key projects underneath it. And we're just genuinely excited now about what this means for us going forward and for Greater Manchester. If there's anyone here in the audience that's working in Greater Manchester who's not been in touch with us, please get in touch. Like, we are really building now quite a long-term, real clear vision of the role that we have to play in this infrastructure, and we just want to be as collaborative, as pioneering, and as effective as we can be whilst we do that. So that's probably where I'll stop, but hopefully that sparks some questions and thoughts for people, and I think Tim's gonna take questions.
Yeah, I'm going to have a go at doing that. We've got lots of questions just flowing in now. We might not be able to take to all of them, but we will do our best. Danny, I just wondered, in terms of listening to Vanessa and that journey that she's been on, what might your thoughts about, the 4 principles that you outlined to us, and how that might work in the context of an organisation that's trying to do things a little bit differently?
Well, first of all, I think it emphasizes the value of having organizations that do things differently. One of the things that very much struck me in what Vanessa said was when she talked about coming in as a new organization and not wanting to teach others. And I think I understand that, because, I've set up think tanks and organizations where others could have reacted in a very defensive way, but realized that it actually grows the market. So I think the most important lesson from both of our talks really is how useful challenges and different ways of doing things, some of which will work in different circumstances in different ways and will attract different types of people and will attract different types of funding. And automatically in the charitable sector, because although this isn't particularly this particular area isn't my area, I've been involved in lots of charitable activity, and one of the things that always happens in organizations I'm involved in is a feeling that somebody else is coming on your turf and you need to and there's also that you need to defend yourself against it. There's also a feeling that the back office costs are being wasted, and that people are being approached twice. And I actually think some of that is worth enduring for the innovation it produces and the challenge it produces, because the most important element of what I've said is you won't necessarily be able to unhook yourself from these cognitive errors yourself, because they're embedded in your thinking, and you do need outsiders to do that. So I think the most important application is that having organizations that come in with a different way of doing things, you should recognize those, you should welcome that and recognize that as being a good thing, rather than getting what we always do is to get into organizational battles where we're annoyed that other people might be stealing our donors or stealing our funder, using similar names and confusing people. No, we should recognize they're good for us.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Vanessa, does that kind of resonate with your thought process from what you were thinking?
Yeah, I mean, since the Mayor's charity existed, we've been just, Greater Manchester the whole country, the whole world has been facing these really immediate challenges, and that's been really galvanizing. So I don't think there's been too much animosity or in Greater Manchester, because we've just been pulling together, and a number of our trustees are really embedded in the sector. Relationships are really good. So I think the groundwork, the foundations of what there is in Greater Manchester, and the kind of, just the galvanizing force of the incredibly high numbers of sleeping that existed back then, plus then COVID, has meant that it's not necessarily been too push and pull. There's not been that much tension. I think what's been woolly perhaps is that the Mayor's charity finding its feet and defining our role. And so maybe we'll get more kickback now that we are clearer about the next stage of what we want to do. But I don't know. I'm going to say this anyway because I'm from Greater Manchester. There is genuinely a spirit of collaboration there, and I think we're really lucky to work with such brilliant organisations and in such an interesting and thought-provoking and challenging, but all for the right reasons kind of way. So yeah, it may change. We may have just been through so much together that everyone's been fairly in tune, but I do think there's a sense, even the charities who are like grafting to try and get in the money to just keep frontline services going, they know more than anybody that something else needs to happen in this system to change things longer term, and that's what we see that we want to do, and so that's a shared goal, isn't it?
Great. Thank you. You both talked a little bit about changing the perceptions of homelessness within the kind of wider media. So just going back to Danny, the news media has got a big role to play in challenging public perceptions of homelessness. And I think we'd love to hear from Danny how we can make that shift and the form of language and approach that we might be able to take.
Okay, well, so there are a number of things. First of all, don't reinforce the things that you want to avoid yourself, right? So people will follow other people, and if you tell them that a certain view of homelessness is common, people will default to that view, and you'll actually have helped spread it. And so I always say this when people ask me about young people voting, right? The more people go on about how young people never vote, the fewer of them will vote. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is people like narratives, and you have to develop the story that you want them to understand, and you want them to integrate homelessness people into that narrative. And then that brings me to the third point, which is don't forget the Mandy Rice Davis principle. You need to think about how solving the problem that you are trying to solve in the public interest is in their interest. This may seem like a cynical thing to think, but I think it's how people think. They may not even appreciate they think this, but they do think like that. So you need to find ways in which helping the homeless helps them, and find arguments, and that may offend against your instinct that people should be interested in solving it just for the sake of it. And some people are, although even those people get something out of it. For example, a virtuous feeling, right? Or a feeling that they're doing something when everyone else is just sitting there. Lots of feelings like that. But people do have feelings which you're trying to satisfy. So you need to think to yourself, what is in it for the person that I'm addressing this to? People don't always think that explicitly, although to a remarkable extent they do. If you do focus groups and you ask a load of grandparents, there's the common political reference, do this for your grandchildren. If you do a focus group and you ask people about whether the country should do something for their grandchildren, the grandparents will always go, well, what about us? I mean, literally explicitly. But sometimes it's just implicit, and you have to explain how it's for them. So I think that's something that's, when you're trying to frame things, that's what you have to think about.
Thank you, Danny. Vanessa, any thoughts from your perspective, just on how we do this great shift in public perception?
I think we were talking about the immediacy of homelessness as an issue, and the fact that for many people who maybe see rough sleeping as the most visible form of homelessness, and that's where their mind goes, that can feel like a very long way away from someone who's living a very privileged life, or is in a very stable, secure kind of world. And actually I think what surprises people is is that it's much closer to home than you realise. And, you know, is it about we're all about 3 paychecks away from ending up at real serious risk of homelessness. That, you know, the number of families who are now experiencing homelessness in Greater Manchester, and I'm sure across the rest of the country, is, you know, what some people would perhaps expect not to exist within the UK. So there is, it's still heartstrings for me. It's even more critical to get those other stories out there. So yeah, I know what you say. If you're challenging a preconception, you can reinforce it. But I think for me, this is about voices and storytelling, and the images that we use, and the campaigns that we run, and the awareness raising. And I think people would genuinely be shocked how close to home that is, how many people they personally know who've had an experience of sofa surfing, or you know, a serious risk of losing their home. And some of the health causes do that really well, don't they? Like, you know, 1 in 2 of us will get cancer in our lifetime. So if it's not me, it's somebody I love, and that's real close to my heart then, in terms of a motivation to give. That's like a very real thing that's going to impact my life. And I think sometimes with homelessness, if we don't challenge what people see, then it can feel a very far way away. And it's not, it's something that's, you know, it's fundamentally wrong within our society, isn't it? And we're all part of that. We've all got responsibility to do our bit. So I think framing is really important from a moral reason as well. I don't know whether that really answers it. I think I went off on one then, but it's
No,
it's really interesting. I find things like that really fascinating.
that's really helpful. No, thank you. Let me address this to both of you, then you can see who kind of jumps in first. It's a question really about how funding works that someone has just put in the chat, which is there an inherent difficulty in finding unbiased evidence when ongoing funding relies on reporting successful interventions? And I guess sticking with the knitting that things work. And there's often little space for experimenting and failing, particularly when using public funds. And Vanessa, you said as a funder, and I know we can do this as well as an independent funder, you can try things and potentially fail. But in the public realm, that's much more difficult. Who's going to take that, Danny or Vanessa first?
Well, I mean, I don't know. You take it, Vanessa.
Yeah, Vanessa, thank you.
So in my kind of career history, I've done the bid writing for social housing and community projects and community arts projects, and it is that old bureaucratic way of putting your outcomes in the application that you write at the beginning, and how you'll measure them, and then reporting on them at the end, and the fear as a grantee of saying actually it didn't work out like that at all, completely, you know, we didn't get anything that we thought, but we got all these outcomes. You know, that's quite rare. You do feel a pressure, particularly if you're in a fundraising role, to give the right answers, to give the answers that might encourage that funder to fund you again, because then you seem like you can deliver on what you promise. And it's a really restrictive system, and it's also not particularly trust-based. And philanthropy as a model as well, which says, hang on a minute, you may be a funder, you may have resource, but a lot of the knowledge sits outside your organization. So how can you be stipulating what success looks like, and, you know, how do you choose that? So there's a lot shifting in the funding world to kind of challenge some of those very old-fashioned, very restrictive ways of working, because you're right, they stifle honesty out of fear, because the funding environment's so competitive. And there's a collaboration now that ACF are, the Association for Charitable Foundations, are convening around flexible funding, and IVAR, the Institute for Voluntary Action Research, they're doing a lot of work around this. Like, as funders, you've got a responsibility to push for honesty and create a non-judgmental, like, welcoming space for genuine dialogue. Because otherwise we're all just playing this weird game where everything's a facade and nothing's really changing. And, you know, it's key. But I do think that the funding sector is shifting.
Thank you. Danny, any thoughts?
No, it's fine. That's fine.
Okay, I think we've probably got time just for one more question. I think I'm unfamiliar with how this works sometimes, but I think some of these things have been flowing through in the chat, and I think the team will try and get back and address any questions that we're perhaps not able to answer in the last few minutes. But we've had a question which is about challenging assumptions that can be barriers to providing services to particularly underserved groups. And how can we begin to challenge some of those assumptions, and how might that fit in what we're doing? Danny, have you got thoughts just on that?
I just originally read it with a sort of horror. I thought it said undeserved groups.
Undeserved groups.
I thought, what? I was like, I must have read that wrong. That's. I mean, that is very interesting. I mean, it's just, first of all, it's completely obvious if you understand these points that I've been making, just the unconscious biases of all sorts are very strong. Particularly if you think about what I said about people serving their demographic interests, it's then obvious that the demographics of the people that you have involved will be unconsciously in the favor of their own interests, and that makes the case. Matthew Syed makes it very well in his book on plurality. That makes the case for pluralism among those people that you have making the decisions. And it was actually a big issue in the Conservative Party, as you'll be aware. You know, the question of whether or not you should try to produce a more diverse base of MPs by tilting it deliberately to have members of more minority groups and also of women. And I was always very strongly arguing that you had to do that because of the unconscious bias of groups that you have. So I think one of the first things to say is you have to aim for a plurality of pluralism and diversity among your decision makers. Because people have unconscious biases. The second is that you have to maintain a formal process of challenge of your decision making, taking into account all of these things, because you have to accept that you can't overcome the biases by themselves. And you need to make sure that you've drawn widely enough the group of people that you're excluding from your decision making, and ensuring that you're not stuck with a kind of norm or just a usual list of people, and that you're also not just serving those people who are capable of shouting the loudest about it, although the fact that they shout the loudest about it doesn't mean they're wrong to do so. So that shouldn't necessarily stand against them.
Thank you, Danny. Vanessa, have you come across this?
I think the key to all these questions is the platforming of voices and the valuing of lived experience and the openness to genuinely listen and be challenged. So it's the staples, isn't it? It's the bedrock of everything. It's genuine, like a grassroots community development approach to designing systems and programs. It's co-design, it's consultation, it's having a multitude of voices, even though that, like you said, they might not necessarily all agree, but it's creating the spaces for those kinds of conversations, and and not making an assumption from where you stand, but listening to people who know, people who live this every day. It's another thing, isn't it, that I think for a funder is sometimes not necessarily a hard sell, but something that really needs explaining to donors as well. That the way things are constructed, the way programs are constructed, the way that interventions might genuinely make change has to come from real knowledge, and we have to value the knowledge of people who that affects. And it's not, it's not for anyone in this system to make a presumption about without speaking to the people who are living it and breathing it and experiencing it. So for me, anything like that, it's co-design, it's consultation, it's it's being open to challenge, it's listening, it's creating the spaces where that can happen. And Greater Manchester's just done some brilliant stuff around with legislative theatre. This was organised by Street Support and the Homeless Partnership, and that was an incredible space for challenge and genuinely giving a stage on a platform to often unheard voices. And we can't ever underestimate how important that is.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to Danny and Vanessa for your contributions this morning. As ever, our time has gone really quickly and we are out of time. I was thinking as I was listening to you about, I think it was Enron, and the team at Enron described themselves always being as the smartest guys in the room. And actually what I've learned this morning is it's probably the person who thinks they're the smartest guy in the room never learns anything. And actually, you should never be the smartest person in the room. You should be the one who's listening and learning and receiving from others and challenging. And maybe that gives us some clues how we might then look to real evidence to make some of the decisions that we make going forwards. So thank you, Danny. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for this session this morning. It's been good to be with you. I think the further sessions this afternoon, and we'll perhaps see folk